Hi, welcome to the Spline Widget plugin. In this plugin we have a spline that we can edit. We can modify this in various ways. Control click, got duplication, multiple selections, multiple delete. We can also close these splines and we can also fill them. If we scroll down to our fill settings here, we can fill the closed spline with a material, or we can render a texture to create a sign distance field for the interior, which updates in real time depending on your settings that are inside these fill settings here. We can also change the material for the spline. So we could choose to have some dots, for example. Use these dots here. And if we edit our scalar parameters for that material, we can actually change some of the stuff at runtime as well. So now as we move this, it actually updates and keeps our intended spacing, for example. And we've got a couple of examples. We've got some with textures. You can play with those. You can change the thickness of this spline. So you can grow this. And then in this case, we'd want to change the size as well. So let's go and change the size here. That's pretty cool. Get a little bit more spacing on these. Change this to a different texture. Very cool. We've also got dashes in here that we can play with. Again, we can play with the thickness to control that. We've also got a bunch of different fill materials that you can use by default. They're just different examples of things that you can do with this. So we'll turn all that off, clear this, and just use the default spline. We do actually have a nice material for just rendering in the ribbon here that just cleans up some of these jagged edges that you can see. So it just smooths that out. And there are some variables that you can play with there as well. We also have this runtime interaction config. So if we click on one of these, we can actually see that this holds the look of all of our spline editing visuals. So if we come in here and set this to green for the spline point color, and then we might want to preview this. So now you can see that those points are green now. You can also use material for these. So we could use this, for example. We could change the draw size of these, and we can also change the hit radius for them as well. We can change our line to be a different style. So we can have a non-dashed or dashed line. We can change the thickness of that. And we can use the same spline ribbons for like dashes or dots on our tangents as well if we want. And then when we actually hit play, we'll actually see those enabled at runtime as well. We can toggle the fill here, and this will update in real time as well. We can toggle it from being closed or open, toggle the wireframe. Let's take a step through some of these widgets here. We can actually pass a world spline. So if I just stop for a second, you can see we've got all these different splines in our viewport. And if I jump over to that level and parse a spline, you can see it's parsing this spline here. And it just parses a different one each time. So in this case, it's this one, then it's this one here. Then we've got this BP on the right. So that's pretty cool. Parse all these different splines. These are some examples of our fill settings. So just different fills. If we toggle spline editing on here, we can go and edit these as well. Add some points to it. toggle the fill. We can also refresh the bakes as well. Just take a second. And we've got a couple of different materials that we can play with as well. On the next page, we've got examples of the path, so we can speed up the panning on these. So we actually have UVs for these spline paths. And when we go and look at the wireframe, we can actually see that these are all different polygons just drawn into UMG. And we've encoded the UVs to be the width of the line and the distance along the spline, which allows us to do these interval logic inside a material that's shipped with the plugin. It's called a material function. So we've got all kinds of different materials in here that can be used. And we can have our fill again, refresh those bakes, edit these. On the next page, we've got an example of an animation. So in here, we've got a keyframed widget that just changes its tangents. We can toggle those tangents to take a look at them. We're actually animating all of these points, which can be done in the sequencer. We've also got anchors. So we can anchor to a widget on a certain side or corner or anywhere in the 0 to 1 space, and we can anchor that to another widget at any 0 to 1 space, and we can actually do that in construction time as well. So we can construct entire trees of skills and things like that through this plugin. And then this last page is just a wireframe viewer. And so for the wireframe, we can actually see that it will add more polygons as needed down this line here, which is pretty cool. And then we're back to our first page. So let's go take a look. Let's go take a look at the animation page. So over here, this is the animated spline page. You can see in here we've got the keyframes, so we can actually scrub through here and take a look at these. And if we wanted to, we could just change one of these to something else. So we could just move this down here. And this is point 1. You can see on the viewer here, it's point number 1. So we'll keyframe that. And now as we move, we can see that that has been saved. We'll move that to here. Save point 1. Pretty cool. There's a compendium of functionality in the main demo widget. So there's all kinds of events. You've got the anchors here. It's how you set a spline point anchor. And you can make a target widget for this. And you can set up the anchors and all the other settings, tangents for which way the line points, and resolve modes for when the target isn't available, whether you hide the whole spline or just this point. And then we've got these clamp logics, which basically stop your mouse from moving outside the bounds of the widget. Now bear in mind that that is based on, if we go and look at a widget here, that's based on this green box. And you've got these options here as well for clamping the mouse here. So if I actually turn these on, you can see that all the points will clamp inside because they're not allowed to be outside. And if we just clamp the mouse, for example, and then hit play, go and edit this, you'll notice that my mouse actually locks to the inside here. It can't move beyond that location. And that will give you the options that you need to control how that might be used. And obviously you might have your spline be actually full size on the screen in this case. So you could move this up like this, and then now we need to move our spline back down. So you can control click to do that and just move it back to where it needs to be. So taking a look back in the graph, let's take a look through some more of the functions. We've got all the different bindings for whether you've selected a point or hovered or dragged a point or handle. And we've got this whole subsystem that gives us all the typical spline functions from a spline component, all the locations at time, distances along the spline and keys, spline lengths and so on. And then we've got all the custom functions that we've added as well for getting the points, setting the materials on the spline itself, on the fill, the ability to render the fill at runtime, get and set those fills, thicknesses, interaction data assets, tangents, etc. So a pretty complete compendium of functions to play with. And of course, we've got all the demo pages as well that you can flick through and take a look at. So that's the Spline plugin. Let's take a quick look at the project settings as well. So if we scroll all the way down to primers, we can see there's some defaults in here which mimic similar to the data asset that we looked at earlier. So this is how you control the defaults if there's no data asset assigned. And then one thing that I want to quickly look at is this default smoothness. So at 1 times, it's the current default behavior, and at 0.5, we halve the tessellation for better performance, and then at 2 times tessellation, we increase the smoothness of all splines. So let's go take a look at what that looks like when we actually change that. So scrolling down here to the wireframe settings, we can turn that wireframe on, then jump back to our project settings quickly, and play around with that smoothness. We just bring it right down to 0, and you can see that we get the cheapest splines we could get. And then we can increase that number to increase the tessellation to make really smooth splines. And another thing we can do is have, say, a default of 0.2. So it's quite light by default, and if you turn the wireframe off, it still looks pretty good. But you can see here in this bend, we have like quite some obvious sharp location. So what we can do is click on the point. We've got 0.0 here. Scroll up to our points. Take a look at our smoothness here and just increase that smoothness just for that area. We turn our wireframe back on. While we do that, you can see that it actually has increased the geometry here. So let's bring that smoothness back down and bring it back up again. So you can do that per point. And then we've also got the anchor settings. So let's go take a quick look at anchor settings. So in here we have some anchors, and of course we've lowered the smoothness on everything. So let's raise that back up. In here we have some anchors for these 3 splines. So on the first spline we have it's the spline coming out here and moving to here. And what I'll quickly do is just clear out the spline settings. Actually, I'll just delete this spline. Let's remake that spline. So we type in spline in the top left, just drag a spline into our canvas. And that should be in the top left now. So we've got these 2 points, and we want to control how they are anchored. So if we scroll down to the points in our spline options and take a look at the anchor settings, we can pick a target widget, and you can set this from Blueprint. In this case, we're going to set skill 1, which is here. And we need to set the tangent vector, which in this case is -1. You can see which way the tangent moves here. And we can control the strength of that to bring it off. And we need to set the anchor to 0 in this case to have it be on the far left of there. And we can increase that strength to make it as strong or as weak as we want. And we have this max length as well to stop it from overshooting if we want to have extra control there. And then for our second point, we set our anchor again to the skill main. And you can see it's 0.5, 0.5 on the anchor position. So let's set that to 1. And then we need to set our tangent vector, which I think is 1, or in this case, -1. So it flows out nicely like this. And then just increase our tangent strength. And then you can see the faceting on the spline itself. So let's go and change the material. We'll go and use one of those smooth materials in our material library. So we've got this ribbon instance here. We'll just pop that in. That's awesome. Then we can control scalar parameters and vector parameters from this widget as well if we want to. Another thing that I wanted to show is the end caps. So if we take this material off quickly and thicken up this line, you can see that it just ends in a harsh line. So let's put some end caps on there. We do both ends rounded. You can see how that now rounds out the ends, which is quite a nice little feature. Could put a material back on there as well. You can see now we have these rounded ends, which is pretty cool. And you can choose whether you want that to be on the start, the end, or both ends. So we could just say start, end, neither, or both. And that's pretty much everything. We have the closed spline options here. Let's go take a look at the fill settings. So we can set a texture here. We can render that new texture. I'm going to lower the thickness of the spline in a second so we can see that texture a little bit better. So you can see that texture in there. That's looking pretty cool. Let's change the texture. Let's go for a different fill. Let's try again. Get an orange one here. Get this animated one. So these are all pretty cool little fill textures that are just exampling different things that you can do with this. And then one of the settings in here is to auto refresh the bake. And when this is enabled, it will overwrite the texture that's been baked. And the texture that's been baked is actually applied to the region texture parameter in this material, which you can change what that parameter name is if you want. And in order to find that material, just click the browser at the top left, and it will be one of the textures that's in this graph here. So depending on what this was called, in this case page 6, we should be able to go in here and actually find the page 6. And in fact, you can scroll down here to fill texture and just hit the eyeglass here and it will just show up. And you can choose whether that fill is in front or behind your spline, depending on what you want to do. And you can choose what the spread is. So if we increase the spread and then render that texture, it will increase that spread a little bit more and decrease that spread. And this works at runtime as well, like we saw earlier in the demo. So just one more time, we'll run through the demo. Toggle the splines here. That's cool. Toggle the wireframe. Toggle the fill. We've got a cool fill on here. Parse some world splines. Very cool there. Different types of materials that we can use. Different types of spline lines that we can animate. Switch these materials up. Animated splines. We edited this animation, so it's doing some fun things now. Then we've got our widget where we were playing with a new widget in the top left, but these are our anchors that we made. So we just set the anchors and off it goes. And then a little bit of spline editing stuff as well. So I hope this helps you out with your spline needs, and enjoy the plugin. Thanks very much.